Welcome to the ASPR podcast Inside Conflict with Moritz Ehrmann. So welcome again to our ACP podcast on South Sudan and Uganda and cross-border dynamics. I'm here again with Mrs. Rose Othieno, Mr. Edmund Yakani, and Dr. Jan Pospisil. Just to briefly remind, Mrs. Rose Othieno is the Executive Director of CECORE, the Center for Conflict Resolution based in Kampala, Uganda. Mr. Edmund Yakani is the Executive Director of CEPO, the Community Empowerment for Peace organization based in the capital of South Sudan, Juba. And of course, Dr. Jan Pospisil is Associate Professor at the University of Coventry, and he's also a member of the Advisory Board of the ACP. So in the last two episodes, we had the pleasure of discussing conflict dynamics related to South Sudan, Uganda, and across the border, including regional dynamics. We had a look at historic perspectives of such conflict dynamics. And we also looked at the nature of the state and the nature of conflicts in these two countries and cross-border today. So what I want to do now in this session is get a better grasp of your perspective as of peace builders. So in a sense, from your perspective, what can be done and what needs to be done in relation to the challenges that lie ahead of us today. And the first very concrete questions I want to ask, and I do ask all of you to give an input on that if you like, would be so. Who are the main peace builders in the setting of South Sudan, Uganda, across the border? And a particular special question related to that, what do you see the role of women as peace builders and role models in their communities and in the larger picture? So who would like to go ahead?
Well, talking about main peace builders might be a difficult part for me to expound on, but maybe to simply mention the various peace builders. First of all, we have the governments themselves doing all that is possible to work on issues around the conflicts so as to bring peace. The national governments are doing all they can. The regional communities, the IGAD, the EAC are doing all they can to ensure that peace prevails in these countries. We also have international players, the UN and the various agencies. We have the international NGOs that operate in this region. And given that the countries we are talking about have either gone through wars or they are still going through wars, we have lots of international humanitarian actors as well as peace builders in place. But above all, over the decades, the locals have founded lots of organizations working on peace building, two of whom are already here speaking. These people play a very, very vital role in peace building. Of course, the amount of work and the nature of the work is very different, maybe from what government can do. But because civil society and NGOs come from the people, live with the people, closer to the people, sometimes they reach these communities even more deeply than the governments do, but of course, being limited with the scope geographically and also financially, but doing everything possible that they can do. And then that brings me to the role of women in peace building. It had always been said over time that women are victims of violence or war or conflict. But we've also learned that they can also be perpetrators. And yet at the same time, the impact, whether some have been perpetrators or not, the impact has always been stronger on the women and the children, as can be confirmed from any refugee flow that you can, click anywhere in the world and see. You will basically see more women and children moving, carrying luggages, like in the case of our communities where they are not like, in the case of, I remember Ukraine, they were waiting for trains and water. In our case, it's not the same. You see women and children carrying mattresses on their heads, a little bit of food stuff, utensils, pulling the animals, maybe for food. You see more women among the refugee communities and the IDPs and fighting to keep life. And there are reasons for this. One is that in most cases, more of the male are in fighting, but also because I would say in the past or even currently, more often the men are targets. So they are most likely in hiding. So the women will go out of their way to try and save their lives of the rest of the communities and the children. But yet they have been more impacted, the women, children, and especially the elderly and the disabled. So the CSOs have been trying to play the role they can, but as I said, we can only do a little. We are limited with the scope and the finances. We are not as huge as governments and maybe some international NGOs. That's my take for now.
Thanks very much. This was a very comprehensive answer to my question. And thanks also for going into quite a lot of interesting detail on the dynamic between male and female roles in this conflict setup, and this important role that comes to women in such a setup when the men are, for one reason or another, simply consumed by the conflict dynamics. Edmund and Jan, would you have anything to add, also with regards perhaps to the effectiveness of some of these actors that Rose listed? So sort of going from the international ones, the local ones, also from a South Sudanese perspective. Perhaps Edmund, you want to go first?
Yeah, thank you. I think, as said, Rose have given a broader scope of the actors, is similar actors in South Sudan. So I really speak much more to the effectiveness of these actors. The effectiveness is that the state actors' role in making peace or in building peace in the communities normally is politically shaped. And this does not sustain presence of peace and stability in the communities for long. Why? Because their engagement always, it have a political interest attached, and the moment that political interest is not met or that political interest is ignored, the chances of the conflict renewing is still high, simply because it's a political approach. But the effectiveness of the actors that you can call them civil society, and by civil society I refer to several actors that even bring in institutions like religious leaders, traditional chiefs, and then the traditional civil society like us, CEPO and others. Once we engage in peace building, our engagement sometimes sustains simply because we speak to the needs of the people and we respond to the needs of the people without any political motive attached in our mediation. So the non-state actors' role in peace building, both at international, regional, and national level, have a great impact, and they are more effective in comparison to state actors. So that's what I will add in terms of that, because in my life, I've mediated over 50 communal violence, and at least I would say out of the 50, 30 have sustained, 20 were political undermined. So it tells you, but we have this big political peace agreement that was mediated by IGAD. We couldn't sustain it. After 2 years, we break again, we revitalize it. We couldn't implement the revitalization, we have to come with a roadmap. And still, as we speak per now, there's no guarantee that this peace agreement, which was mediated by IGAD, can really hold peace and stability in South Sudan. Still communities are fighting. So the community or the non-state actors approach to peace building is much more effective and much more sustainable compared to the state-driven processes for peace building. Thank you over there.
Thanks, Edmund. And I see you nodding, Jan, on the screen. Would you like to expand on this notion that of effectiveness that plays much in favor of local actors who have a much more sort of sustained but also needs driven approach as opposed to perhaps national or international actors? Yes,
I mean, it's different roles different actors play, but in terms of peace mediation, there was, I mean, as Rose has also showed, like a thrive toward African actors, especially in African conflict, and then also more towards local actors and supporting local actors in their peace building efforts. There's still this protection component in peace building, and here, of course, international actors come in. But effectiveness is a double-edged kind of thing. It's the one hand what you do and what you can achieve in terms of what you want to achieve, and it's also how you are perceived. And especially like in South Sudan, the UN here is in a very difficult role. With the UN mission is becoming more and more unpopular in the public perception. So if we would make, I suspect, if we would make a kind of a poll at the moment and ask what people think about UNAMIS, the absolute majority of people would state they should just leave, which is kind of a substantial problem when you look in terms of effectiveness. So the perceived effectiveness among the population of the UN intervention is very low. I'm not saying this is true, because hardly anybody else has a chance to provide these protection components, especially with all the local conflicts in the country popping up in various parts. But this has to be taken into account, and the reputation of traditional authorities, elders, but even local government in engaging in peacemaking is much higher. And since people have broad buy-in into these efforts, it's also kind of more effective.
Yeah, that makes sense, and I agree. Of course, perception is one part of the question. Then again, of course, the perception affects reality, and therefore again affects on effectiveness. So yeah, let's have a deeper look into the national perspectives again, and perhaps a question to you, Edmund. So, what, in your opinion, would be needed to break this recurring cycle of violence in South Sudan? And perhaps attached to this question, do you think that there is still a potential for a large scale violent conflict in the near future?
Yeah, thank you. For South Sudan, the political approach to peace building through signing of agreements like the way we are witnessing right now, it actually contributed another factor in conflict prevention, or I don't know how can I term it, but I would say like the negotiated peace agreement have decentralized conflict. So it have taken conflict out of a national level, among the political elites level. It become more decentralized conflict within the communities, and it have changed the equation of violence, that usually violence is politically geared in terms of group of individuals will form a revolutionary movement and they will pursue objective. Mainly the objective is to access power. But now in South Sudan, after attempt tries for political peace agreement, the scale of the violence have gone to communal now. It's becoming more ethnic violence. As we speak now, we have over 6 pockets of ethnic violence across the country. And this is coming from our early warning system that we're managing in the country as an organization. So these 6 pockets of ethnic violence is a decentralization of the politicians, the political elites. Some of the political elites who have engaged in the peace process at national level have tended to zero themselves to go back to the communities and start fighting using tribal line within the communities that they are. And most of them are generals that are known from our armed forces, but now they have become militia leaders for their communities and they're fighting. And as we speak now, over 60% of the country is facing this communal violence. So my answer to your question is that yes, still in South Sudan, we will expect a large scale subnational violence, which are politically motivated. Usually police will call it intercommunal violence, but I think it's politically motivated but it has been carried out at subnational level. So we're going to witness a lot of these crises. As I said already, we have 7 active subnational violence that are on ethnic line. And if you see the machinery they're using for fighting are really coming from the stores of the government. So there are modern weapons that were purchased by the government. And I'm involved in tracing use of arms and ammunition by communities. And my indicator of tracing is that I come to realize that some of them are official purchased weapons by the government. So it found its way from the stores of the government to the subnational level. And these are the indicator that qualifies the values that are going subnational level is politically motivated and aided by the political elites at national level. And now if I want to bring the international players into this context, international players are so limited. Why? Because mediating such communal violence does not require the formal proceedings of peace building, or what do you call a checklist that you can see, usually you negotiate around power sharing, protocol around responsibility sharing, or reforms in terms of institutions or policies. There, this particular format can't work. That's a format where people are just hungry for power and control of a territorial. So this limits the international. And I think this, for me, raised the concern that I'd like to add to part of your question is that I think in the school of peace building right now, we need to start building coordination and collaboration between the international norms for peace building and the traditional norms for peace building. So partnership between local actors and international actors in building synergies and coordinating efforts for prevention of conflict, I think is now very important, because sometimes also local actors doesn't have enough capacity and capability of analysis of the context of the violence so that they can find a better solution. Because prescription or what do you call digesting the conflict at communal level, sometimes we're lacking expertise for that, but we have international expertise. So that's the element of coordination that international can come and help the national players to have the skills of how to really analyze conflict and move. So I think that's my answer to your question. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Edmund. I mean, that was extremely concrete. I mean, at the one hand, answering to the question sort of where are the potentials for violence, and you seem to have identified that quite clearly. Also the reasons for it. And then, of course, this notion of local international collaboration, I think, is one that is extremely important. And I think if we talk about our institutional cooperation between my and your institute, I think this is exactly what we're trying to do. So I think it's a point that is slowly but surely is recognized on all sides of the spectrum. Rose, perhaps let's get to the Ugandan context and ask a similar question. So what would be needed from your perspective, a large question, I know, to achieve lasting stability without violence in Uganda?
I would also like to start by saying that a lot of the conflicts in our region, I think, are multifaceted. First of all, we have, I would believe, economic decline. And I don't know who can explain this, because we are talking of very well endowed areas, but this could also go alongside governance. And because of economic decline, there are lots of crimes taking place. There are grudges for coming out of maybe unfulfilled expectations. So people are taking to doing acts that are not very favorable for the neighborhood and definitely for the nation. Part of this is also aggravated by the fact that we have large populations of youth, many of who are not employed, many more are unemployable. That is in a quotation mark, because I mean, talking of an endowed area, there could be areas where maybe not much skill is needed, like in agriculture, but there isn't enough support. And now comes into play this whole climate change with very unfavorable weather. This morning I was talking about the change of weather, December being very rainy, that is not to be. And therefore, there is a lot that brings dissatisfaction to the communities. So for me, the whole idea of empowering the communities, and that cannot solely be the role of NGOs, because you can only do a little in terms of peace building. But I think governments have to make more determined efforts. Much as I know in Uganda, the government has tried to put in place economic programs to try and address this. But the unfortunate bit of it, as peace builders, we have always said these have not always been conflict sensitive. Top down, someone sitting somewhere and deciding what program and how and what community, then you find maybe the very people who should have been addressed with such programs are not addressed. A few programs have been targeting, for example, youth, but then there are still criteria. They tell you have to be not the unfortunate youth, but not very poor youth. You have to have formed groups, and yet these are communities that may not have been in groups. So sometimes the people who should benefit from such and get dissuaded from doing wrong things are not involved in, because as an NGO, we have been working in areas of post-conflict and maybe even current conflict, working with groups that have been involved in violence or armed conflict. And some of those we have got out of this have told us that they will never go back, because some of these are swayed into getting that with promises, which are usually, if not always, never fulfilled. You are unemployed, someone tells you, come, we are going to be giving you dollars. Back here, when we talk of dollars, people believe it is a lot of money. But even those dollars are never given. And then people are radicalized, and then they are lost. And then, unfortunately, the political arm doesn't know that some of these people are actually helpless. Recently, we have this problem with the Congo border. You must be aware of the ADF and M23. But the ADF, the Allied Democratic Forces, have been attacking the country, the border parts, and even into some districts in the country. The last was where we were told some of these children who were arrested, did they talk of like 8 years or something? And rebels. And in our small group in the office, said, really calling them rebels, is that right? But that's what, I don't know, the narrative gives them. But these are many times children who are forced into this. And now this whole thing again comes in with the illicit flow of small arms. And I go back to my brother Edmund. We have problems with the borders of South Sudan, also sometimes with northwestern Kenya, where the arms are not well controlled. In Uganda, the government has made several efforts to disarm communities that have been most armed, especially the northwestern parts of Karamoja. But in South Sudan, it's not the case. A while back, we had an exchange meeting from members of Ethiopia and South Sudan with the National Focal Point on Small Arms, and we were amazed to hear of the fact that sometimes when arms have been collected, they again disappear. I think there is a weakness. There is a weakness in the way arms are handled, and these are communities that our borders are very porous. There's hardly any control. But a lot of efforts need to be put in empowering the communities, both economically, education-wise. Yes, you have many schools, many tertiary institutions, but hardly any employment to keep the unemployed busy. So there is a lot to do, and it needs the efforts for everybody. And like Edmund rightly put it, sometimes the political solutions, so to say, I put solutions in brackets because they are proposals normally, not solutions. So these political solutions are not always sustainable. Like I gave examples of programs, many programs, especially in this current government. Now we have what we call the parish development model. Even that one has, conditionalities of how people should get organized, how they should benefit, and we don't know whether this is the best way to do it. from my own perspective, when I was growing up many decades ago, we had very strong cooperative societies for the different farmer groups in the different countries. If such could be reinforced, it might, give enhancement to economic status for most of these people. The areas that were growing cotton, we always had those stores, coffee the same, but in the recent past, we've had problems with the coffee. Now all of it is being privatized. Recently, the coffee purchase and whatever it was being given to an external actor, an uproar came. I don't know how far it has gone. So those are some of the challenges that the government may think they're doing the right thing, but because maybe there isn't sufficient consultations with the communities, they are not addressing the issue. And without that, we cannot have, the real peace that we are talking about. Peace of the freedom from the fighting and freedom from the hunger and everything else. So, and especially when, people who try to talk about some of these things don't feel so comfortable talking about it, Sometimes you get labeled for, try bringing anti whatever, or some political statements, but sometimes they are really trying to talk for the people. So, but all in all, we don't have real large-scale violence, but there is that tension that we see among the communities, especially the poverty level. Much as the national statistics may read something, but when you look at the difference between the haves and the have-nots, I see it bigger. Because when I was growing up, there are facilities I could see in my local community that I don't see them enjoying now. So, there is quite a lot to do. And I think the economic empowerment is the beginning of everything. Because just to get out of this region, when I was following the World Cup and reading about Qatar, and I was saying, there can be answers to things once people are satisfied economically.
Yeah, indeed. That's the foundation of many things. Yeah, and then very important your point about this community empowerment that you were talking about. Of course, this is a large-scale effort, and you're probably rightly saying that government needs to have a role, but also the right kind of role, at least a conflict-sensitive and needs-driven role. And of course, also different actors can support dynamics that, in a sense, that governments feel motivated to act in such a way. I think this is also part of the role of different external and local actors. So thanks a lot for that. Different dynamics like the climate change element we're going to discuss in just a minute. But let me, meantime, address another question to you, Jan, also from your academic perspective of looking at conflict dynamics. What, in your experience and your opinion, is needed to avoid armed conflict and especially to build anything resembling lasting peace?
Yeah, I mean, I think the main issue, and I think both statements have shown this, it's very difficult to approach this technically. Like collecting small arms sounds like a very smart way, but the problem is arms are coming and people are completely unwilling to disarm if neighboring communities stay armed, because then the risk of just being overrun now. And like it might sound a bit conservative, but there's still a component of rule of law, or like Mary Calder has called it, civicness. And this means like a culture of rule of law that is just, I think, as important and something that needs to be developed and developing actually, because nobody developed it externally. And it's a generational effort. It's an interesting thing for coming as an outsider, insider to South Sudan. I'm there quite often. But if you talk with people about things, political developments and all this, they would always tell you, oh, I know this guy, I know this guy, I know this guy. So like the networks are all, and these kinds of thinking also then mean like to a certain extent this can swap over to like, okay, these are my guys, these are the other guys, and we go for it. So there is a culture of just like dealing things out that can turn violent, and this is obviously not this won't be settled by laws, but just in stating laws, but it's more like a culture of civicness. So there is a culture that needs to be at some point to break and to change, I guess. And this is something which takes time, which is developing, and which works better in some areas versus in others. I mean, one of the things about, I guess, both countries, Uganda and South Sudan, is how different they are, also in terms of the life realities of people. And it's like, from a European standpoint, you would think this country works quite similar, like these countries work quite similar, but they're huge, and the lived realities of people are more different probably than any like lifestyle within Europe. And this has to be taken into account, how different this is, and like what the cultural aspects are.
Yeah, this is hugely important to work according to the context, of course, and culture plays a huge role in this, of course. Very interesting also this point you raised about the need for a culture of rule of law. And as you rightly said, this is a long-term effort, but something that focus needs to be put on. And I think all of the local representatives of local organizations we have in this conversation, I think you're all working in this respect, in this sense also. Let me now turn to my last set of questions. So the role of climate change in all these conflict dynamics in Uganda, in South Sudan, and in the region. It's of course a dynamic that affects us everywhere. The weather is turning strange, unpredictable, and destructive in all parts of the world. And it affects our way of life, and it affects our way of life even more when structures perhaps do not work as well as they should. Let us specifically turn to South Sudan and Uganda in relation to these questions. So how is climate change concretely affecting on conflict dynamics? And immediately attaching a second question to this, can such conflict dynamics that are related to environmental or climate change related aspects, such as reaching a sort of common or joint management of natural resources, can such efforts also be an entry point for building peace at different levels, in your experience? Perhaps let us start again with the South Sudanese perspective and hear from Edmund.
First, as you said, climate change is becoming real in our life. And in South Sudan, we have experienced two main shocks that are climate change related. One shock is a flood, which is now almost affected over 50% of the country. In terms of our states, 7 of our states were affected with the flood and have led to displacement. It has brought a new trend of violence where people are competing over the limited small highland for either cattle keeping or cattle grazing, and then human settlement, but at the same time also farming for food security. So that small land is becoming competitive over several human priorities. It's either keeping the cattle or settlement or farming. That's come from the flood. And the second shock we have is the locusts. When the locusts were migrating the region, also the locusts have affected some population. And the locust migration have element to do with the climate too. So I think climate have created a phenomenon that is really affecting peace and stability in the society. And I think that's why now it's very important for us to talk about climate security. It's really necessary for us to look into that. So as I said, that climate is real and it's really affecting our population. And out of the 6 violence that I've mentioned that the country is now facing at sub-national level, 3 of them are climate related, where there's a migration of population to other people's land, and their migration, they occupy a land. That land is competitive between either is pastoralists migrating to farmers, like in South Sudan from jungleists who are pastoralists, they migrated to some parts of Eastern Equatoria, Central Equatoria, who are farmers. As we speak now, we have registered a death of over 17 to 18,000 persons that are dying almost monthly. related to question of climate-related violence. So I think it's claiming life. Climate change is affecting human life and is claiming lives and is increasing violence. Yeah, in terms of responding to some of the climate challenges, as I said, intervention that we can do related to climate response or to climate challenges mitigation or resolving climate crisis, I think it'd be an entry point. For example, we can use planting of trees in a community where we can bring conflicting communities to plant the trees together. So planting of trees can be a tool, an entry point for peace building in a way that you plant trees, bringing together youth or women or leaders from conflicting communities. So in the process of planting trees, they can build trust and confidence, and they can start discussing some of their potential violent issues in that particular engagement. Or even distribution of food to climate affected population. In that distribution of food, you can bring people who are coming from conflicting communities to work together. So some of these interventions of climate change can be an entry point for peace building. And this is where, especially if you start using the notion of peace building through livelihood. So if you start using peace building through livelihood, you can work. I can give an example. I've worked with USAID under their project implemented by Wildlife Conservation Society along the river, where we use fishing as an instrument of bringing Dinka and Mundari. And these are two conflicting communities. So we bring a section of Mundari and section of Dinkas, they build one particular fishing group and they fish together. And that particular individuals are no longer more engaging in violence because the boat is very important. If they fight, they will lose that boat. They will lose the fishing nets because it's a single thing that improve their life. So we can build peace through livelihood. And I think climate change interventions can be an entry point for peace building in a communities where they're having a conflict that are climate related or conflict that merge as a result of climate change. And as I said, like in South Sudan, the floods is a big issue. That's one of it that I'd like to say it affects. And I think also climate change is raising incidents of negative stereotypes and xenophobia. And Jan, you can see in the context of South Sudan, when the Egyptians want to dredge the rivers. So we start developing xenophobic ideas towards Egyptians and stereotypes towards Egyptians, and it goes beyond Egypt only because Egyptians are coming for an Arab identity. People start thinking about Muslims, and the Arabs are trying to come back and destroy our environment, though they want to clean the waters. So for me, climate change have a big impact on local conflicts, national conflicts, and even it have impact on global conflict. So you may see flood in South Sudan as the only South Sudanese issue, but now see it have dragged Egyptians into it, and not Egyptian only. It have even dragged some people in terms of how do you handle these floods issues. So I think for me, climate change, it is an issue now, and should be an agenda that as a peace builders, we must consider it seriously because it is real in our life. It's forcing people to go for a new type of violence that people actually even die, and they can really die for it because they have no option to respond to the climate changes. Thank you very much.
Thanks again. I mean, a really hands-on answer from your perspective, of course, of working deeply inside the dynamics and problems that exist in your country. And thanks also for these really concrete examples of how these deep and structural problems and very problematic dynamics related to climate change, and how practical actions can actually be an entry point for peace building. I mean, I think that's something we always have to positively keep in mind and attach sort of these solutions immediately to the problem. Rose, in Uganda, you already touched upon it, the heavy rains when it shouldn't rain and so on, that is confusing everything, and the general dynamics of unpredictability and extreme weather dynamics. How does that affect on conflict in Uganda, and what do you see in terms of entry points for peace building, in addition to what Edmund already said?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, the unpredictable weathers, as I said earlier on, is already impacting on especially not just the farmer communities, because once the farmer community is affected, even those in urban areas are affected, because people used to know that in a particular month, in a particular period I would be planting. It's no longer the case. And as I say, sometimes even the weather station says something and it doesn't quite happen. So it's already impacting on food insecurity. I wouldn't call it food security. Food insecurity for many communities. This is also now leading to people encroaching on wetlands, thus further exacerbating the issue of climate change, because now that makes the rain patterns change even more. And as a result, we have also seen many floods with some deaths recorded. At the same time, the droughts are also extreme, that also have the resulting impacts. Much as in some of our activities in peace building, we have started bringing the issue of tree planting. The government itself has also tried to encourage it. Some local communities are doing it, but there is yet a lot to be done. We've also had the problem of mismanagement of our forest cover, because most of our forests have been depleted over the years. So it will take time to bring this on board. But as we are rightly quoting here, it would be a good entry point to bring communities together to work towards, say, tree planting as a way of, bringing the would-be conflicting communities to do something in common. And probably once you bring various communities together, they'll be keepers of each other, and probably the trees would be saved. For us, other than calling it peace building through livelihoods, we like to term it connectors for peace, because for us peace builders, we are not directly concerned in dealing with livelihoods in the past. But I remember when we went to one community where we were, that is the Karamoja semi-arid area, with lots of small arms and pastoral communities that do a lot of raiding. And we're working with the youth group, the boys especially, who are most known for the actual raiding. But of course, the whole community is involved, as you will come to know. The women, bless them, they cook for them as they go out, they have diviners. So the whole community is engaged, because that was their livelihood. When we try to change some of them, at the end of the training, they ask us, yes, we all like peace, but are we going to eat peace? And because people can't eat peace, we have to work on the environment and ensure that the trees are back, the forests are back, the water is there. Most communities where I used to see a lot of water flowing, now you go and find there is a shortage of wells and water. Water levels are low. So there is a lot to be done. But I know the government has made it a point to encourage tree planting, but still a lot more needs to be done. We've seen the rains I'm talking about. Last week we had lots of rain. Bridges get damaged. People get drowned in these floods. And that means also a cost to the government. So money that would have otherwise been used for something else now goes back to reconstructing roads. So it's a cycle. It's a cycle, and we really have to grab it with both hands and all do something about it.
Yeah, so really tackle the preventive measures that you mentioned in terms of planting trees and other mitigation measures as quickly as possible, because this vicious cycle of destruction and rebuilding, of course, is one that should really be stopped. Jan, you have the last word. How does this look like from your perspective? Sort of using a structural issue such as climate change that affects dynamics across the board. Using such a dynamic as an entry point for peace building, how does that look like from your perspective?
I mean, what has to be said, and it has been mentioned before, what climate change does in terms of conflict landscapes, it regionalizes. There's no way not to, especially when there's like long rivers such as the Nile, and you have like rain all over. Then you have like hydropolitics that start from like the Lake Victoria in Uganda. They open the dam here. South Sudan gets flooded, not because just of the rain in South Sudan, actually because of the rain in Uganda. And then it all goes downstream, with Egypt being permanently like concerned that they won't get enough water out of the Nile, so they are in turn then in conflict with Ethiopia. And Ethiopia, by the way, just sold some of the hydro out, like the electricity outputs of their dam to South Sudan in turn. So like there's the interrelations are just amazing what happens here. So I think in a weird kind of way it opens up opportunities. So it makes things much more complicated in a way, because you cannot have these neat solutions targeted for like unity state in South Sudan because it's flooded there. But the floods come from elsewhere. No? So in a way, it becomes more complicated, but it gives also the chance to regionalize the issues in a way and tackle them in a more holistic way, I guess.
Yeah, this is of course a dynamic that has been on the news, and therefore hopefully would receive the right amount of attention. This whole notion of that countries are of course connected through the rivers, and of course climate change has a huge effect on how rivers flow and where the water might reach or not reach. So hugely important. Anyways, thank you very much. Again, a hugely interesting conversation. Huge pleasure hearing from you. We will, of course, come to an end through this discussion on our conversations about South Sudan and Uganda. But thank you very much, and we'll be in touch for sure on many, many other issues. Take care and good luck.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Subscribe to our podcast or visit the website insideconflict.com. For more information about the work of the ASPR, visit aspr.ac.at. Until next time.